Okay, so you have sound on, Eric?
Sound is on.
All right, for everybody online, I think we're back in business. So thank you for your patience and sorry for the wait.
All right. I'm gonna pick up again with community interactions. Yeah, I can't get that presentation.
Are you sharing through me or you?
It's through you. The screen is through me, and I
Okay.
think sound is through you.
Okay.
And this screen is through you.
Okay.
Okay. Community interaction. So this is another
Your
kind of
camera's over here though.
year-round, day-to-day.
Yeah, you stand there.
Okay. So we have to just advance them all. All right. Year-round, day-to-day activities. A lot of this is communications with neighbors and public, such as yourself, responding to questions and concerns via email and phone. We also interact with our agricultural lessees and coordinate on actions that might affect prairie dogs, like removals and restoration. We provide updates for OSP, the Open Space Board of Trustees, and also the public. So example is this meeting tonight. And then we provide additional or requested information, whether it be from the public or the board. We're also available to provide information, educational materials for students, and respond to requests for information from media. Right, you can advance.
I think it was me, but it's
Community. All right, next. I'm trying to get it to do.
I think it's just because it has to be on this one.
Okay.
And that's just the sight, the eyes and the ears. I advanced it to next.
Yeah.
Oh.
But we need to get it up here too. Okay. On the next slide.
All right.
Conflict reduction also is ongoing throughout the year. Internally, staff works together to avoid impacts to prairie dogs, and this might be during trail construction or trail improvement projects, utility maintenance, oil and gas work. And typically what we do to avoid impacts is suggest routing to avoid prairie dog colony areas. We might mark burrows to for more fine scale avoidance, or conduct passive relocation to close burrows if we can't go around them.
They just can't see the hole.
No. Need to move that or just minimize it. There it goes. Oh, thank you. Responding. Okay. I want to maximize.
It's okay. We're just gonna roll with that.
Yeah, he's getting smaller and smaller. Okay. All right. So a big milestone for conflict reduction this year is we finally kicked off our pilot program for barrier cost sharing with OSMP neighbors. This project, as some of you probably know, has been several years in development. It's involved cooperation and discussions with a lot of OSMP work groups and extensive involvement with the city attorney's office as well. So as I said, it's a pilot program. We're giving this initial tryout. We had a open application period for 2 weeks that closed on December 3rd. We've received 30 applications. We will be evaluating these applications based on some predetermined criteria so that we can score and prioritize if needed, if demand outstrips our set aside money. We have $75,000 in funds for this initial pilot program. And I expect that we'll make announcements about awards in early 2025. The structure of the program works by paying for 50% of a barrier, but this is based on a flat fee based on the length of the barrier at $12.88 per lineal foot. And that amount comes from the average of what we've been paying contractors to build these chicken wire prairie dog barriers in the last year. We will be looking at, that's fine. We'll be looking at continuation of the project, but that will be dependent on project success. We will be soliciting feedback on how it worked, and then of course, available funds in upcoming years. So, yes, okay. Plague management. So sylvatic plague is a bacterial disease that can completely kill most or nearly all of a prairie dog colony. So we distribute sylvatic plague vaccine because one of our management goals is keeping prairie dogs on the natural landscape. We have a plague management plan that was completed in 2021. Per the plan, we distribute sylvatic plague vaccine on about 250 acres in the southern grasslands and also at our relocation take site, just to give a little bit of extra plague protection to those relocated prairie dogs. We purchased the vaccine serum and the bait matrix from external vendors, and then Colorado Parks and Wildlife manufactures the baits themselves at their facility in Fort Collins. We distribute the baits in 2 rounds. So this essentially functions as an initial inoculation and then a booster round. Okay, you are doing it. Here's a picture, shows what the baits look like. They're just little balls about 1/2, 3/4 inch. They weigh about 1 gram each. The serum, the vaccine serum, is incorporated into a peanut butter based bait. The prairie dogs obviously ingest it orally. The peanut butters to make it palatable to them, so they seek them out and hopefully have a good uptake rate. We distribute about 50 baits per acre. We throw them out by hand in prairie dog colonies. And that 50 baits per acre is a CPW guidance based on their research. The habitat suitability model update. This year, we are just about complete with that. We have a few data gaps remaining, and that's mostly based on some vegetation mapping that needs to be updated or completed for some newer properties and properties where the vegetation mapping hasn't been updated recently. This model update ultimately will be used to help determine management designations for any new prairie dog colonies that pop up. And it's also part of the decision process when we're evaluating potentially new receiving sites on our system. So black-footed ferret conservation, we began conversations internally in OSMP at OSMP this year to talk about black-footed ferret reintroductions. And this is because our land management neighbors at Boulder County and also at Rocky Flats National Wildlife Refuge have stated it as a goal to reintroduce ferrets on the land. And since we have land in common in the southern grasslands, they're kind of looking to us as a potential partner. So ferret reintroductions require at least 1,500 acres. And in the southern grasslands, the county, Rocky Flats, or us individually wouldn't have enough acres, but all together there would. So that's why they're looking at the partnership option. In the next year, we'll be bringing in our integrated pest management coordinator, who is pretty new in the position. And that's because having ferrets introduced means you have to be pretty aggressive with plague management if there's an outbreak. And that requires, again, insecticides for fleas. So that'll be an important part of the conversation. Citywide, a couple of other departments also do prairie dog management and monitoring and control. There's a legal requirement at the Boulder Airport and also the Boulder Reservoir Dam to remove prairie dogs. So that's done by lethal control on a regular basis. Parks and Recreation performs annual mapping, monitoring, barrier maintenance, and sometimes some relocation projects, although they didn't have any relocation work this year. The City Department of Planning and Development Services is the department that oversees permits for lethal control and burrow destruction. They did receive one request to receive prairie dogs on city land, but we don't have any capacity at this time. They also received notice of a relocation project on private property within city limits, and 56 prairie dogs were trapped there and relocated down to Pueblo. They did not receive any lethal control permit applications this year. Our 2024 operating budget covered Prairie Dog Working Group task implementation, relocations, plague management, and some barrier work. Expenditures were about $62,000. Our relocation this year, again, did not have to cover costs for site preparation since the prairie dogs were all taken down to Pueblo. So that saves some costs on one hand, but on the other hand, we have added expenses of transportation of the prairie dogs. Prairie dog funds also supported some barriers and restoration work on other irrigated ag properties aside from the relocation site. We're looking at 2025 expenditures to be pretty similar. Except for the funds for the pilot barrier cost share program, which have been earmarked separately and identified. And again, that we have $75,000 marked for that. So a relocation project this last year was a portion of the Teller South Prairie Dog Colony. And that was a 17-acre portion on the Anderson property. We had a contractor trap and relocate the prairie dogs. They trapped 185 prairie dogs between September and October. Prairie dogs were taken down to the Pueblo Chemical Depot just east of Pueblo in more southern Colorado. They were either taken down the day they were trapped or held in an approved facility overnight. Pueblo Chemical Depot has been receiving prairie dogs for a few years to bolster their prairie dog populations because they are actively involved in black-footed ferret reintroductions. They got to the point last year where they're able to release 35 ferrets on their property and an adjacent property. And again, this year they released 25 ferrets just a couple weeks ago. So it's nice that our prairie dogs are able to support ferrets elsewhere in Colorado. For 2025 relocations, this is going to be dependent on available receiving site. We don't have capacity on our OSMP system anymore, so we'll be pretty much reliant on Pueblo taking prairie dogs. They have to, the Department of Defense, which manages the land where the prairie dog reintroductions are located, will make that decision in the spring. And that was the same process that's happened this year. So we will just be sitting tight to finalize our plans and find out if they will take prairie dogs. Okay, so that's the end of my section. At this point, I'll take any questions specific to the content I just covered. Eric is going to talk a lot more about agricultural removals, restoration, and stuff. So I might punt your question, but go ahead.
And then we'll certainly have time at the end too
Yeah.
for any other questions or questions we don't get to now.
Yeah, I have several questions.
All right.
The pilot project, the cost sharing on that, you said it's $12.88. Is that the 50% amount or the 100% amount that you then take 50% of?
Okay, so I'm going to repeat your question so people online can hear. So the question about the barrier cost sharing program, the $12.88 per foot, how does that interact with the 50%? And that's a good question. I didn't clarify. So at $12.88 per lineal foot, if you have 100-foot length that you want to cover, that is $1,288. Am I doing the math right? Yeah. And we'll cover 50% of that cost, so $644. And I will add that you can use different materials if you want. We have standards and requirements, but if we approve your different materials, you can use them, but we aren't going to provide any additional cost for different materials.
Okay. And then there was something up there about Boulder Valley Ranch being a relocation site.
Yes, so it's potential. We're looking at somewhere in the northern part of the system and potentially a site on Boulder Valley Ranch or potentially a site on some other areas that are slated for prairie dog removals. And that'll really depend on kind of if and when we have a relocation site, and then what the management and other factors going in, what makes it easiest to do relocations.
So you're relocating to
No,
Boulder
no,
Valley?
no, no. Relocating from and taking them down to Pueblo.
How do you make the decision which colony to?
Yeah, it depends on a number of factors. The question, sorry, is how do we decide which colonies to relocate? In some cases, it might depend on the management category and other land uses. And then other factors that relocation, we like to have barriers in place if possible so that the prairie dogs are being trapped from a defined area. We need to make sure that there are no cattle on the area so that the traps aren't disturbed. No irrigation can be going on because the state requires we apply delta dust. And so we need to make sure that delta dust doesn't get into irrigation water or any runoff. And other factors just kind of, around logistics of having traps out, and other aspects of trapping and removal.
I have an online question I'm gonna jump to. So what are the changes that were made to the habitat suitability model and definitions?
Oh, that's a good question. So changes made to the habitat suitability model. Some of it were just updates. We had updated vegetation mapping. We had new parcels added since the last habitat suitability model was put together. This time, we also added some social factors. So this included things like number of neighbors. I think we looked at size of, presence of other agricultural infrastructure like barns and corrals, and factors that make prairie dogs, even if it's suitable for prairie dogs from a prairie dog point of view, it may not be suitable for them from a human and social point of view.
And for everyone online, if you do have questions, please type them in the question and answer box and we'll work you in along with those that are in person.
Are you gonna be going over the type of barrier and where you sharing? Is that the big piece of fencing?
The question is about what type of barrier is covered in cost sharing. So the standard that we suggest is chicken wire, and that is because it is the most cost-effective barrier. The best barrier you can build is both a physical barrier to them digging, climbing, and visually. Chicken wire, obviously they can see through it and they can climb it sometimes, but it's so much cheaper than a metal barrier, which can be really cost prohibitive if you have a long distance to cover.
So the barrier that went in at Keller South by the parking lot, I presume was for the prairie dogs.
Yeah.
And the fence was put in, and then the chicken wire was put in, and then there was extra chicken wire at the base, but it was never buried. And then the chicken wire was put on at 2 gates kind of farther away from the parking lot towards the end with the big red gates. But the gates were left open for extended period of time. And so sometimes we just wonder if the right hand at open space talks to the left hand, because why would you go to all the effort and cost to put up the barrier and then leave the gates wide open for passing?
Yeah, so I'll repeat that question real quick. Just talk about barriers, and especially at Teller South. There's some gates there, and sometimes they're left over for extended periods of time, which seems to defeat the purpose of barriers. And I agree that sometimes it does, and sometimes we just have to if there's a lot of coming and going. Also, at that specific part at Teller South on the east part, the prairie dog colonies aren't really close up against the gate, so I feel like it's less risk of many prairie dogs crossing, but certainly it is a hole in the barrier. I'll add that we did punch a couple of holes in that barrier because there's coyotes in the area, and these barriers not only block prairie dogs, they block or impede a lot of other animals. So we did put a few holes in vegetated areas that prairie dogs are less likely to use so that the coyotes can move around and still follow their commute through the larger property. Yes.
The other question I had was a little card that was sent around and talked about barrier and barrier sharing.
Mhm.
And it implied that people had to put it on their property.
Yes.
So if the prairie dog colonies were just on the other side of the fence,
Yes.
then you expect people to put the barriers
Yes.
on their property. That's still.
It's still not ideal. Again, yeah, this question is again about the barriers in the cost share program. It is suggested and requested that barriers are put entirely on the property, including the chicken wire apron. And yeah, this isn't ideal, but in many cases, it's not feasible or functional to put it on the OSMP barrier fence if we have plans to do anything to that fence, if the fence isn't in good condition, or if we have management actions planned for the other side where that barrier would interfere. So that is not ideal, and there is an option for people to put it on the on the boundary fence if conditions support that. And that requires signing extra agreements and stuff like that. So, yeah.
It's just a big, it's just, it is an issue that people who got cards have to deal with.
Yeah. Yeah, and
There's a lot of confusion about barriers.
yeah, well, certainly people who applied, they'll be getting one-on-one communication with me and other wildlife staff on how to fine tune it. So why don't we move along to Eric's
Yeah,
section?
Tori, I would just mention, we do have several questions online that-
Okay.
that are probably more applicable to future sections of the presentation, so
Okay.
we'll get to those.
Yep, and if anybody's questions don't get answered by presentation, we have time afterward.
Yeah, I have no cadence to this, so
Okay, I
good
just-
luck. Eric Fairley, I'll be talking about prairie dog conflict on irrigated agricultural properties. And so just a little background, it's important to note that lethal control on open space, with except for some exceptions, was approved by council in September of 2020. So that's when this project really got going. There's a wildlife protection ordinance that Tori mentioned, and so there are exemptions within there for irrigated agriculture because it's identified as a public improvement project. And so that allows us to do lethal control and removal as well as burrow disturbance in occupied areas, which helps us get the job done. So we have a special permit to do this type of work, and this is only for the most part happening on irrigated agricultural fields. We sometimes have unirrigated pieces within a field that get removed as part of it, but it's irrigated properties. And so the project components is irrigated fields are the best opportunities for agriculture on open space. And so we want to reduce the conflict between prairie dogs and irrigated agriculture. And one of the best ways to do that is through lethal control. We have a goal of annual removal up to 40 acres, so that'd be relocation. And then we're aiming for 100 to 200 acres per year for lethal control on irrigated agricultural fields. And barriers, we use barriers to help reduce the ability of prairie dogs to get back into those properties so we can reduce lethal control overall. And then, of course, there's a lot of restoration and irrigation infrastructure and fences infrastructure that I'll talk about in a second that occurs on these properties following removal. So our goals: reduce conflict between prairie dogs and irrigated ag, reduce the impact of prairie dogs on individual agricultural tenants, increase the number of properties that are released in the irrigated agricultural field, increase the acreage of irrigated agricultural land that's in production, and to improve soil health, reduce noxious weeds, reduce erosion on these properties. This is my mandatory ugly map, just kind of showing the spread of sites that we've worked on over the past 4 years. A lot of the sites in 2024 are kind of like more east and south in the irrigated agricultural realm, whereas most of the sites prior to that were kind of north and west of the diagonal highway. A lot of numbers on here. I'm clearly not going to talk about the dozens of sites that we work on, but a couple of things I want to point out on our PERC, our lethal control project, is one, we had massive expansion in 2024. And so what we do is when we're planning, we use the 2023 prairie dog colony mapping acres to help us plan for what we're going to do and where we're going to do in the next year. Well, that kind of went out the window this year. We had massive expansion, which Tori will talk about later. Take a look at Autry. I guess there's no way for us to point at that, but it was mapped as 5.7 acres in the fall of 2023 and removed prairie dogs from 33.3 acres. That changes plans when that happens. Another thing we want to talk about is we start counting the number of burrows per acre. We have 8 hoses. The number of burrows per acre matters. And so the combination of how many burrows you have per acre and the amount of acres you have is really what determines what you can get done. We have this magical number of trying to get 150 acres per year done, but the reality is if they're all at 100 burrows per acre, that might not happen. And so you got to look at both of those when you're actually coming up with final results. Oh, sorry, go.
Got
I'm gonna point out Johnson South because I'll talk about it later. We mapped 16.2 acres in the end of 2023. And Rob and team removed prairie dogs from 84.8 acres this year. Massive expansion. But so we have a massive expansion because of the drought. We have a new program. We had a 2-week moratorium because of the fire ban preventing us from getting out onto these properties, so we couldn't remove prairie dogs for 2 weeks. And we had some staffing issues. Even though we had all those issues, we still removed prairie dogs from 296 acres of land. That was a combination of contracted and staff time. Note that was also 12/2. And so Rob and team and contractors have been working since then. So it'd be much higher than that by the end of the year. So that's not saying that we're going to be able to do this every year, but we can catch up to the backlog of control that we have. That's good. And so for 2025, we're planning on removing prairie dogs from a portion of Bowler Valley Ranch. So field 112, 114, and 98, which don't really matter to anybody unless you have a map in front of you. As well as continuing with the follow-up that we have in all the other previously removed properties. We're shooting for somewhere between 250 and 300 acres. You saw a couple slides before that our goal was 100 to 200. Bringing it in-house and using contractors allows us to catch up to that backlog of follow-up control that we're facing right now. Barriers, nice and quick slide. I can't read it, but chicken wire barrier, 3,840 feet installed on several properties, and then hard barrier, 1,830 feet installed on Anderson and Teller North. That's it. So this brings us to irrigation after we do restoration after we do the removals. And actually, in the process of removals, we're also doing work. That's when all the heavy lifting of land restoration and infrastructure work happens. You can see a lot of pictures of irrigation on this slide. We spend a couple $100,000 a year updating the irrigation and sometimes completely recreating the irrigation on these systems. A lot of times there's new gates, new fences, new culverts, new diversion dams, new ditches, culverts to allow us to have access throughout the property. So a lot of work goes into these properties following removal. In addition, we're working on the soil and plant communities on these sites. So we're doing soil amendments, typically compost, key line plowing, which I'm not going to talk about in detail, but feel free to ask a question. Could have just answered it right there by not saying that. Seeding and irrigation is really important. We got to irrigate what we're restoring. Sometimes the tenant does that. And if it's not leased, we do that. That's a lot of work. Noxious weeds. We have a legal mandate to manage all list A noxious weeds on our properties. So that's eradication. There's a certain suite of list B noxious weeds that we are eliminating per state mandate. And then we're suppressing all other list B noxious weeds per state mandate. And so that's a combination of hand pulling, spraying, mowing, whipping, and keep in mind with the suppression, that's not 100%, that's suppression. We're not going to be able to mow every single thistle plant on some of these properties, but we're suppressing it to reduce its ability to spread. We have 26 project sites, I think. I lose track at 20 because I can't count that high. But so I'm not going to go through everything we do in all these properties. It'll take an hour. So the information's here. Feel free to look at it. It's getting recorded. But it's basically a summary of the tasks that we did in 2024 and what we plan to do in 2025. I'll point out a couple of properties. Anderson property is a new site that's the relocation site this year. So prairie dogs relocated off the site and brought down to Pueblo. I think it was 17 acres of removal. That's a property where it hasn't had much management in the past couple decades. The fences are completely choked out by Russian olive and crack willow. So Russian olive and crack willow have to be removed before we can even fix the fence to get cattle back on. The irrigation ditches are covered by crack willow and Russian olive. So they have to be removed before we can fix the ditches, before we can even irrigate the field. A portion of the site is a mess. So key lining, composting, seeding, ditches have to be recreated, culverts have to be recreated. We have to test the whole system out. A lot of work is going to go on to just one little property. And I think it's important to make sure people understand the load of work that can go into some of these properties. Not all of them, some of them are great. Cowls, we put a lot of, that was, I think, 2022 removal. We put a lot of work into it initially. It's doing well. There's still prairie dogs out there, but it's coming along pretty well. We have some noxious weed work to do. We'll have to do some burrow leveling as we continue to remove prairie dogs. We might have some spot seeding, but it's easy now. DeLuca is a site that's being removed, probably not right now because it's dark, but like literally now. That's a new site, but it's well vegetated. We'll have to do some burrow leveling. We'll have to do some seeding, maybe. But that's one of those sites that, yeah, it's like, I think it was 5 acres of prairie dogs, but restoration will happen really quickly. Johnson South, that's Rob's nightmare. He's probably shivering right now. I mentioned this before. We had 16.7 acres mapped in 2023. By July of 2024, there's 85 acres out there of prairie dogs, so very rapid expansion. And so not only were you putting a lot of work to rebuild fences, rebuild irrigation systems, diversion boxes, manage 30 acres of noxious weeds out there, soil health improvements, key lining, we're doing a lot out there. But that level of prairie dog expansion plays a toll as well. So now we have to re-burrow level 85 acres of land, which isn't quick. And there's going to have to be some supplemental seeding associated with that. Tie that into the nasty drought. You know, we expect a lot of this work to carry into 2025 and probably beyond. Oasis, I wanted to talk about this because this is like a blank slate. It's like restoring an irrigated ag field on the table. We had to do a significant amount of work just to get water back to the property, which is a lot of coordination with the neighbors and other ditch users. The entire irrigation system had to be recreated. You could see little divots where the ditch was, but the whole thing had to be recut. This is a 70-acre property. That takes a lot of work. Multiple diversion boxes, multiple culverts. We had 30-something acres of thistle out there that we had to address this year. Gates that were too small to get equipment into, so we had to change gates, which changed culverts and accesses along roads. A lot of work, not to mention that it was a terrible field. So unfortunately, there's about 50 acres of prairie dogs out there again. And so we're gonna have to go back through and do a lot more burrow leveling and seeding. But you know, that's one of those properties that we're talking about 5 years minimum before that could be, you know, released to the public for leasing. It's a long ways off, unless we get lucky. We can skip over that, just more sites. Yay, pictures. So this is Cowles. I mentioned it before. We did a lot of work out on Cowles. It was a pretty rough site for decades. Our prairie dogs removed. There's still a couple out there. Seeding happened. Key lining, compost, I think. We can go to the next slide. And that's what it looks like 4 years later. There's still some bare ground and some thistle out there, but even the thistle, just to mention this, we did no aggressive treatments on the noxious weeds out there. They used to dominate the site. We did no spraying. All we did was remove prairie dogs, get vegetation going, do a couple spot treatments with mowing, and it kind of disappeared. New West looks green, but that was completely dominated by bindweed and thistle and teasel prior to work. And then we're good to move on that one. And then now it's dominated by perennial grasses, forbs, and legumes that we seeded out there. So expenses, 2024, approximately $500,000 spent. We expect to spend the same next year. Draw your attention to PERC, the top line item. And so we did not plan on having contracted PERC or removal of prairie dogs, but the situation called for it. And so we did. And so about $130,000 of this removal and barrier and restoration project went into contracted PERC. We expect to do the same thing next year. There's a big backlog. Won't talk about any other numbers except for we plan on purchasing another PERC machine next year to help us out with this backlog. We won't necessarily have 3 PERCs operating every day, probably have 2.5. But I just want everybody to know that we plan on ramping up a little bit to catch up to this backlog. And then not all of our work is prairie dog removal. And so there's a shared learning collaborative, which is an interest of some members of the public to bring a collaborative group together that consists of open space, agricultural tenant, prairie dog advocates, soil health advocates, and a farmer to see what can we do in the presence of prairie dogs as it relates to restoring an irrigated agricultural field and having viable agricultural production. I'm not going to talk about all the things that the Shared Learning Collaborative has done out there, because that is also another hour presentation. But we've, chickens and pigs, good irrigation, seeding trials, bale grazing trials. We've done a lot out there, but really what I want to focus on is we are seeing really impressive improvements just with good irrigation and good grazing. Where the grazing, the animals are moved frequently and there's a lot of rest. And so this site did deteriorate in the presence of prairie dogs with irrigation and cattle, but it's also now regenerating with prairie dogs, irrigation, and cattle. So how we manage these properties makes a difference. And so you can kind of go through the slides relatively quickly. So that first slide was year 1, this is year 2, and this is year 4. Massive improvements in vegetation and growth and productivity. A lot of that's just, thorough irrigation and good cattle movement. And then the next site is Minnetrista. Minnetrista isn't faring as well as Canino. That's 2 properties that are part of the Shared Learning Collaborative. You can flip through those. Slight improvement. If I had taken my photo to the north instead of the west, you would have seen really impressive improvement on that site. But I took these photos a long time ago, so I wouldn't know where to take a photo. But so we're seeing a mix of kind of static conditions, some improving conditions, and some really improving conditions on miniature. So it's a mixed bag. And again, I think the key here is that, when you're dealing with conflict with prairie dogs, yes, they eat vegetation, they eat a lot of it, and they clip a lot of vegetation. We all know that. That is a stressor on the plant community, and it's a stressor on the soil. But what we're showing is that with good irrigation practices, not stopping irrigation, basically, and good cattle movement, as you're getting the benefit of the cattle from grazing, their manure, the urine, in combination, we're able to kind of achieve our goal of reducing conflict between prairie dogs and irrigated agricultural fields. Some fields it's not going to work on, some fields it can work better on. There probably is no common ground for a veggie field, but the point is management makes a huge difference in this project, in this this conflict management between prairie dogs and irrigated agricultural lands. And the more we can learn and share from a project like this, the better. So.
And I think in the interest of time, we're going to have Tori she has a fairly short final presentation, and then that will save us time to just roll through questions at the end. So if you do have questions for Eric, go ahead and hold on to those for just a couple more minutes. And for those online, go ahead and type them into the Q&A box, and we'll get to those very shortly.
All right. So I'll roll quickly through monitoring and associated species. This is annual work that we do is mapping all occupied prairie dog acres on the OSMP system. We do this every fall, starting in September. This year, mapping went from beginning of September into early November. We did document really system-wide expansion, like Eric said. Overall, we saw a 17.6% increase in occupied acres over last year. So we're at 5,510 occupied acres, which is the highest number of occupied acres that we've mapped on the system. Yep. I can't control that. No, I can't control it. Yeah.
Sorry about that.
We documented 122 active colonies. So that's up 11 from 2023 when there was 111 active colonies, and we found 3 new colony locations. And as Eric alluded to, this extensive expansion we think is really due to the super dry conditions from late spring into fall. That prairie dogs spread, because vegetation is short and they like that. They can spread out and they can see their predators coming, so they feel safer spreading out, but they also need to spread out to find more food. And I will note that if you're interested in accessing these occupied acres data sets, actually that shows on the map. Show it. There we go. We have the spatial data was just made available on our open data portal through the OSMP website. So this map just shows occupied acres colony-wide. It's color-coded by management designation for each colony. I also will note that we have a slightly different color scheme this year, and that's just to try to help make colors more easily discernible with people with color vision issues. The dark green colonies are colonies within the grassland preserves, and that's where we manage prairie dogs as part of functioning natural ecosystem and all the biodiversity that includes. Prairie dog conservation areas are in dark brown, and that's where prairie dogs on the land are our main management goal. Multiple objective areas are in yellow, and that's where prairie dogs can exist with a number of other management goals. Transition areas are shown in dark orange, and removal areas are in purple. You see, that's kind of hard to tell on that map, but those areas, transition and removal areas, are where prairie dogs are in conflict with our desired land uses and land management. And so that's where our irrigated agricultural acres are. Okay. Here's the acreage breakdown by management designation. Again, you can see increases across the board. I will note that transition and removal acres, we did our mapping before a lot of removals happened. So we map some of these acres do not reflect removals that have happened through the fall and ongoing now. But regardless, we did see expansion across the board, except ironically on prairie dog conservation areas. I think that is because the moisture earlier in the spring, we saw really widespread growth of yellow clover, which grows really tall and thick, faster than the prairie dogs can clip it, and it tends to kind of fragment and concentrate prairie dog colonies on lands where other land uses aren't knocking those kind of more weedy species back. All right. Here's, okay. Look at the wrong side. So we have management targets in our grassland management plan related to prairie dog occupation. And one of these is for the grassland preserves themselves. Our management target is to have 10 to 26% occupation of the total grassland preserve area. This year, we are still within our management target in the southern grasslands. We've only achieved that in the last few years. Before that, southern grasslands were at low occupation, as it took them a while to recover from plague outbreaks about a little over 10 years before. The northern and eastern grasslands are still well above our management occupation targets. Other grassland plan management targets or indicators are percent of occupied land that's in protected status. So those are the grassland preserves, the prairie dog conservation areas, and the multiple objective areas. Our target is to have over 70% of all prairie dog acres in those categories, and we are well within that with 85%. As I stated, the grassland preserves, we only have one within our management target right now. And another target or indicator is the extent of all active colonies being within 800 to 3,137 acres. And again, we're well above that right now. Another aspect of prairie dog ecology and management on our system is monitoring for associated species. So burrowing owls, they're listed as threatened in the state of Colorado, and they're a state species of conservation concern. They're migratory, so they're just here from late spring through fall. And in our area, they are entirely dependent on prairie dogs when they are in this area for both cover, and that's where they nest and raise their chicks. They usually return to the same area every year to breed. And this year we had 2 pairs. They raised a total of 8 chicks. Let me go to the next slide. Usually we see them in slightly different places in the Gun Barrel Hill area, in closures designed specifically to protect burrowing owls. This year they moved a little bit, and one of our pairs ended up establishing a nest in a burrow right next to the newly completed Vesper Trail on Gun Barrel Hill. They were detected right after the trail construction was completed and before the trail was opened. We had some hurried and intense discussions about that internally and made the decision to postpone opening the new Vesper Trail until the owls completed their breeding. So that postponed opening of the trail from the plan, which was mid-June, to mid-October. We do I want to express my gratitude to the community for being really patient with this situation. This was unusual. I think we hadn't had to postpone opening a trail for a reason like this before. But I think it was gratifying to see 8 outlets fledged from this area. That is all the information we have for our presentations. I think we are ready for questions. Yes.
You stated, you made a statement, I think, I didn't catch it. The number of burrows per acre,
Yes,
is this an ideal number or? what is-
yeah, so the question was about my comment about number of burrows per acre, and that's how many burrows we're seeing per acre as we're doing the removal process. And it's just you know, we have eight hoses, and so the greater the number of burrows per acre, the longer it takes to do an acre of land. So it's oh yeah, I can't really show that. So our perk machines are basically Rob, a like an engine, and it pumps out carbon monoxide. And it comes out through 4 hoses, and we stick those hoses into the individual burrows. And so that number is just a reflective of what Rob has been counting when out in the field, how many per acre, just because it gets this speed of operation.
Do you have an idea of how many, what would you consider ideal for the population, a healthy population?
There isn't information about that. The question is, what is an ideal or healthy number of burrows per acre? And I think there isn't really one. It's kind of whatever works for the prairie dogs.
And I think it depends on the location
Yeah.
and the soils and the plant community of each site.
Yeah, our numbers range from 14.3 to 100.9 burrows per acre, and I don't know why.
Yeah.
Just yeah.
Let me read one from online. What is the plan to restore native grasslands destroyed by prairie dogs and invasive weed infestations? And a separate question, but related, is specifically for the Heatherwood subdivision area, where much of the vegetation has been severely reduced or even eliminated. Are there any plans for restoration or relocation for the area? So I don't know. Do you want to field that, or I can? We can. Specifically Heatherwood, and then more broadly native grasslands.
Okay. Yeah, I think at this point, we don't have plans for restoration for those areas since they're not irrigated agriculture areas. And our current management direction is to address irrigated agriculture, since that's our best opportunity to improve production, improve soils, and support the agricultural community. Do you have anything to add?
Yeah, I would just say there are opportunities. Prairie dog populations do cycle, and when we've had epizootics of sylvatic plague move through a native grassland system and the prairie dogs are no longer there, we have taken advantage of that in some circumstances to do some native grassland restoration. So those would really be our opportunities within our current management framework for prairie dogs and native grasslands.
And a piece of that was noxious weeds. We have a very robust noxious weed management program, and very, very, very capable hands, nice sized crew. And so they're out there 4 days a week managing noxious weeds, whether it's a native grassland with prairie dogs or not. So that's being handled as well. A lot of land, takes a while to get to it, but it's getting done.
There are other strategies on properties that are leased for grazing. Sometimes we adjust the cattle grazing rate in the presence of prairie dogs, so that we don't have we're not sort of doubling up on grazing in some of those areas. But certainly one of the characteristics of a prairie dog occupied native grassland on open space or out in the Eastern Plains or 150 years ago is areas of bare ground and kind of a shift in the vegetation community. So while we do have areas where we have very widespread prairie dog occupation in large areas of that, when we're at high population levels and very dry conditions, that is sort of one of the characteristics of a native prairie that comes along with the Boulder community's focus on protecting prairie dogs in those native prairies. Anyone else in person?
So with your 78 to 81% occupancy on your northern grassland preserves and eastern preserve, and your wish to be at no more than 26% occupancy, do you have any plans for how you will achieve that?
So the question I'll repeat on the computer is, are there plans to reduce occupancy on the northern and eastern grasslands since prairie dog occupancy is well below above our management targets?
It has been for
And has been for some time,
10,
indeed.
12, 15 years.
Yep. So we are planning removals within Boulder Valley Ranch, and those are grassland preserve management designations for some of those colonies, but there also is that irrigated agriculture. So therefore, the new rule for increased removals applies for those properties. Otherwise, our management direction right now is to address those irrigated ag lands. So for the eastern grassland preserves, we currently don't have a plan for how to reduce occupation there. Certainly, if there are reductions due to plague outbreaks, we would take advantage of that as we see fit, depending on the conditions, to try to move in and see if we could do some sort of restoration. But that would be very opportunistic. And yeah, and the feeling is right now, putting seed or anything out where there's so many prairie dogs is just feeding the prairie dogs at this point.
So you're just gonna let your lands continue to degrade in those areas?
We were letting the prairie dogs stay on the landscape for
And the
now.
lands continue to degrade.
And again, I think it's a series of trade-offs. So there are certainly benefits to prairie dogs in grassland preserves. They support a large diversity of associated species that are real conservation focal species for open space. And so there are downsides to high prairie dog occupation. There are upsides to prairie dog occupation. I think across our properties, we see a variety of types of prairie dog occupation. So where there may be some areas that have high areas of occupation and a heavy impact to the soils and the vegetation community, there are other parts of the system where we don't see that. And I think that over the last 10 years, we've gone through really a series of community conversations about what the priority for addressing prairie dogs on open space is. And really in 2020, where that settled on was all of your energy should be focused on removing prairie dogs from irrigated agricultural lands and restoring those. And everywhere else you should be conserving prairie dogs. So that is the current community direction as supported by City Council that we are implementing. Now, as conditions change and as we make progress on our irrigated agricultural fields, that policy direction may change. But for now, that's really the policy direction that we're operating under. And let me do one online just quickly. How often do you monitor the fences and barriers? The barrier fence at the Oasis property has been filled in by blowing dirt on the eastern border, so there is no longer a barrier.
I'll take that. So barriers, this year, 2024 is the first year we really had the capacity to monitor and maintain our barriers. And so we're going to start doing our inventories on these barriers every year, every other year, whatever's needed, and maintain as necessary. We have a moratorium on lethal control between March, April, May. And so that's gonna be the big window where we fix our barriers and maintain them and remove the debris off the barriers from windstorms. And so Rob will be addressing that next year. So
Let's take one in person.
So I'm really glad that you're working to preserve and restore the irrigated ag lands, but I also have a question about is there any priority in preserving the trails? So for example, specifically, if you're going from, Teller North parking lot to the crosswalk at Valmont, prairie dogs are moving into that trail. It's currently manageable, but at the rate that they're taking over, it'll be more problematic. If you cross the street and go on to White Rock, show the single track trail, that the past couple of years, the prairie dogs are just taking over. I'm an equestrian. Riding horses becomes much more dangerous when you have to worry about prairie dog holes. And on a single track trail, it's much harder. There's fence on both sides. It's much harder to avoid those holes in some areas, so I'm wondering if there's any thought towards prioritizing preservation of the trails where prairie dogs are getting over.
Yeah, so again, I'll repeat the question. So the question is about how do we manage prairie dog burrows when they pop up on the trails? And we do, I mean, certainly they do get close to the trails, but typically if a prairie dog burrow does occur in the trail, our trails crew has tools to go out and close the burrow using a passive relocation technique so that it doesn't violate our burrow destruction ordinance. So I would say if you see something in the middle of the trail, yeah, submit, like, is it still the CRM called it?
Yeah,
the
on
prior
the
folder?
city's website there,
Yeah.
we have a, submit a comment or question
Okay.
link.
I mean,
that We'll get that to the appropriate staff.
Yeah, and and where the trails go through prairie dog colonies, the burrows are going to be along, close along the edge of the trail, and that's
yeah. but
that's the
I'm
trail
worried about
conditions.
there.
Yeah. So yeah, submit a notice about that, and that can get on the trail crews list. I know that they keep an eye out for that. I think we had in the Colorado shirt, and then Andy.
I have a few questions. Can we get this presentation?
The presentation is being recorded, and then we'll be posting it on the Prairie Dog Management webpage within a couple of weeks.
Next question. What's the difference between the hard barrier and the chicken wire? Why do we see hard barrier some places and chicken wire other places?
Okay, question is why do we sometimes do hard barrier and sometimes chicken wire? It's ultimately cost benefit analysis. We typically do hard barrier if we are literally cutting an active colony in half at a fence line or some other boundary and doing removal on one side and leaving the colony on the other side. So there's going to be really hard pressure against that barrier, and then it's worth the time and expense to put in that hard barrier. If we're not just directly going through the middle of a colony, we'll use the chicken wire because it is so much more cost effective. It's a lot cheaper to build. No barriers 100%. The hard barriers do better, but they're still not 100%. So the chicken wire still slows them down and reduces the number that can cross that boundary.
And I didn't hear this because I can't hear that well. Did you say when you're doing the chicken wire now for private homeowners, you're gonna be doing the chicken wire on their inside of the fence or on the exterior side? So in other words.
Yeah.
Is it on the interior?
So
side?
it's both. Again, this question is about the location of the barrier for the cost share program. We're encouraging people to have the entire barrier, including the apron, on their property, and then also leaving some space in case wildlife like deer or something need to move through and don't get trapped between a double barrier that's close together. And that's because in some cases, it's just not going to work to have that apron on the OSMP side. It might be because the fence can't handle having the prairie dog hung, or the chicken wire hung from it, or if any land use or management we're doing on our side will be impeded by that apron on there. So I recognize it's not ideal in all cases. Honestly, from a wildlife point of view, barriers are not great because it doesn't stop just prairie dogs, it stops all sorts of animals. But we definitely also see, that our neighbors are frustrated when prairie dogs cross on from OSMP land. So we're trying to strike a balance with this program.
And I think in both cases, the apron would face the active prairie dog colony.
Good point. Yep.
It's just whether that sits on the open space property or fully within the private property.
So. If the prairie dogs are burrowing animals and they burrow right under the chicken wire,
They can. Yeah.
they do.
Yeah, they do. They do.
And so not having the chicken wire out towards where the prairie dogs are coming in doesn't make sense because they're gonna come up to the fence and it's gonna roll, and instead of climbing up the fence, they're gonna stop and they're gonna start digging and they're gonna go right under.
So the prairie dog, the apron always faces where the prairie dogs are coming from, with the idea is that they hit up against the apron and try to dig down, and they can't because that apron's in the way.
So you're saying it is on the open space side then?
It faces, but in some cases, if people want to participate, they'll need to have the entire barrier, including the apron, on their property.
But going back to Teller, the apron is not on this, like Teller South, the apron is not on the side where the prairie dogs are. It's on the side with the trail where people put their dogs.
The Teller South, it faces the existing colony that's on private land to the north. The colony
Oh,
south,
that's across the-
yeah.
Yeah, but the one but you relocated the prairie dogs from.
That's from the Anderson property that's not near the trail. It's up against Arapahoe Road. But we also are removing the colony that's south of the trail that goes from the Teller South trailhead.
My last question, what kind of collaborative work are you guys doing with the county? What kind of collaborative work are you doing with the county for prairie dogs?
So
And you know, Heather, where I live,
I do.
let's talk about the Brubaker, Sorensen, Stratton.
Oh, okay.
What are you guys doing with the county to make this a better situation for the private homeowners? Are you guys doing anything?
Yes, so we keep in close contact with the county. They have different management plans and policy direction than we do, so our approaches aren't always consistent. But on properties that we co-own with them, one agency takes the lead on the management. In areas like Brubaker, we were out there, was that 2 years ago or
Think
just
so.
a year ago? Discussing with the county what their plans were and what our plans were to make sure that they would work together. So where we can find those areas where we can stay within our management direction on our property and they can stay within their management direction on their property, and we can find those areas where we're as consistent as possible, we're certainly looking for those opportunities. There are places where our two different departments have different management and policy direction. And so the consistency is not as high as it would be ideally. And that's sort of the reality of having two different landowners with different goals and different policy guidance on two different properties.
What is the purpose then of two different entities buying properties that butt up to each other? And having a property that's not separated? And it's separated by this imaginary line. So what's the purpose of Boulder County Open Space and City Open Space purchasing land together if they can't manage it together with the same policies? And it just it's beyond me. So I don't understand. What is the point of purchasing those properties?
Yeah, and I can understand it. It certainly sometimes sets up fairly complicated situations. In most cases, those properties would have been bought at different times by the agency that at the time that the property became available had the funding and the interest in managing it. And so certainly there's a lot of management objectives in open space, both county and city purchasing properties. One of those is to limit development on those properties. And so I would say both programs have that shared goal, and that is certainly realized by purchasing those for open space. When we get down into the finer details of management, again, for some management, there's a lot of consistency between the county and the city, and for other management, there's not. So in some cases, we have agricultural lessees that cross boundaries between city and county, and it's kind of a shared collaborative cooperation on both properties. And it makes sense with those shared goals for us to very closely match up our management. In those areas where we do have different goals or policies, sometimes we do have that inconsistency across the property boundaries.
I'll add to that just a bit, Heather. So we do have a memorandum of understanding with the county that outlines which entity is managing which property that is co-owned. So by and large, for most of our properties, they are being managed by either the city or the county and their rules and regulations. Brubaker is a bit of is one of the outliers with that, and primarily because of prairie dogs.
Little knobby right there.
Why is it an outlier? Why is Brubaker an outlier?
I'm not real sure why
That predates all of us.
How is it an outlier?
it was not included in the memorandum of understanding. I'm not real sure exactly what led, why it is an outlier, but it is one co-owned property that is not part of our MOU.
I would like to give one question. So the question is about when you were talking about Oasis, Eric, you said if we get lucky on Oasis. I don't know if you remember saying that. I think the question was about what would that look like if we got lucky on Oasis.
And lucky is weather, right? I mean, we don't control weather and that determines everything on some of these properties, but a diverse perennially dominated pasture. I don't know if we would have hay out there, maybe. So Lucky is a site that's dominated by native and non-native perennial grasses, forbs, and legumes that are suitable for agricultural production. Noxious weeds are very minimum. Bare dirts bare soils at a very minimum. That's what success will look like on some of these properties. I don't know if you remember the photo of Cowles. That's not quite there, but that's kind of what we're moving towards. So a site dominated by dirt and bindweed and thistle and moving it to a perennially dominated system. And restoration is about luck. If you have 3 years of drought, tough, figure it out. It's brutal, but hopefully we get lucky and have some good rains and things can really speed up.
Maybe one more quick question online, then we'll come back to in person. If the owls return to Vesper Trail, will you do a seasonal closure again?
That's a good question. I think lots of different work groups within OSMP are going to have to discuss that if that happens. We're hopeful they will not nest right next to the Vesper Trail again, since it seems that they moved in this year just at the sweet spot of low activity between completion of construction and opening the trail. So I think there'll be a lot more just activity on the trail, people and their dogs using it, and our hope is that that will encourage the owls to nest farther away from the trail. Good.
You mentioned that overall prairie dog acreage increased by 11% this past year, year over year, I believe.
17.6%.
I'm
Yes.
curious, how does the removal and perk sites integrate into that data?
I haven't analyzed the data. Sorry, the question is how do removal and perk sites, how are they reflected in the mapping and occupied acres this year? I haven't broke it down site by site. And again, we did the mapping kind of right in the beginning of the removal season. So not all the removals are reflected in those numbers. We did see, it's a bit disheartening, honestly, to see the big increases on the transition removal areas just because of such widespread expansion this year. But if we weren't doing removals, the numbers would be even bigger.
I mean, if you even took those sites out of it, the numbers as a whole without those sites would be.
There still would be some increases, I think.
Yeah, and I think that's not a surprise in a year as dry as this one. That may or may not correspond to actual population increases. Lots of times when we have drought like we did this summer, the prairie dogs become less dense, but they move out into more area looking for food. I think Tori mentioned that, and then also the low vegetation stature makes it easier for them to move around more without the fear of having predators being able to sneak up on them. So it's not a one-to-one relationship between expansion of acres in a year like this and numbers of prairie dogs. I'm sure there's also some increase in number of prairie dogs, but a drought like this summer probably also leads to lower survival. So I think there's some balancing there. In wet years, we see those numbers go back down. And that's also not necessarily related to a reduction in the number of prairie dogs, but a reduction in the area that they're occupying.
A couple questions for Eric. That map that you showed, you said it was up on the web. The map you showed of the with all the different colors of the prairie dog occupied.
Oh.
Do you have an address for that?
I don't have the address for the open data portal off the top of my head. If you go to the OSMP website and Google open data portal, or you scroll down to there's an option to see maps and data, and that gets you to the open data portal. From there, search for prairie dogs, and there's 2 different data sets. One is max extent, which shows the maximum acreage occupied over all our years of mapping for all sites, and then one is year by year occupation.
There was also a slide, you were talking about like Johnson and Coles, and you had different slides of all the properties. There was a very last slide that had some properties on it. I was just wondering if I could see that one again.
Yeah, the question was about some of the slides I had with
This one.
the work we've done in different properties. Was it this one?
And again, we'll have this whole presentation posted online so you can have a closer look in the next week or so.
Let me go to one question online. Eric, this is probably for you. This is about removals from Brubaker in 2023. And that following removal, there were still prairie dogs remaining. And at least at this point, return removal has not occurred yet. And so I think sort of wondering why removal happened, but there still seem to be prairie dogs on the property, impacting neighbors, and yeah, they're still there.
So the removal process takes a long time. You have a drought like this, and like Heather mentioned earlier, and probably Tori, it's very easy for 3 prairie dogs to open up acres of colony again. You know, so we don't know what the numbers of animals are on Brubaker, but doesn't matter. They're going to open them all back up. And so it's a long process. We now have staff internal to open space, which gives us significantly more control over how we manage the removal process. Brubaker and Stratton are high on our list because they got pretty well occupied very quickly. We're hoping the contract goes out in the winter, but probably we'll have to wait. If they can't get it into the winter, we'll probably have to wait into after the moratorium, which is beginning of June. But that's on our list, just like all the other properties. And, you know, if as long as weather is supportive of us, we have the support and the money to get back after these properties and make sure that doesn't happen again. It's hard.
And then another piece of that question was, how do you operate 2.5 perk machines?
I was going to answer that when I said that. So how do we answer? Basically what that means, we're going to have 2 full-time dedicated staff running perk machines. And then we'll have the third one for if other staff have like we remove the site and there's a couple prairie dogs left, and maybe the tenant manager of that property can go out and remove those prairie dogs, or maybe Rob has a meeting in the morning, but he's free in the afternoon. He can go out with that third perk machine while the other 2 are occupied and handle some properties as well. So 2 dedicated and 1 is kind of whenever we have an opportunity to use it. I assume on average over the course of the year, it'd be 2.5 perks operating on any given day.
What's the moratorium you just mentioned, June?
You're probably better at answering that, but he sent you the pupping season for the moratorium for when we cannot do leaf control is when the prairie dogs are pupping in their dens.
I thought,
Is that what it's called?
I thought that was removed.
At the county
For
level,
county. I'm
yeah.
sorry?
At the county, removed the moratorium, but at the city level, we still have it.
Okay. So
And that's part of our urban wildlife protection ordinance at the city level.
you guys are gonna get nowhere. I'm sorry. You're not gonna get anywhere in the Brubaker Sorensen. You're not gonna get anywhere, folks. How can you sit there and have a property that butts to each other and one works year round and one waits until the pups come and you have another 50 or 60 animals on the property? I don't understand it. You guys, it's a losing battle. And you know that. Thank you for your time, but this is so frustrating. So frustrating. Come out and see what it looks like.
I know what it looks like. Yeah.
Come out, see my house. Come to my property.
Another question from online. Thank you for sharing your perspective. Staff works very hard on these properties, and as Eric has shown, we do have some pretty good successes on some of the properties. Some prove to be far more challenging than others, but Eric and Rob keep chipping away at it.
Yes.
And I'm sure it's very frustrating on some days.
It's hard.
So one question online is about the barrier on Brubaker, and the distinction between where the apron on the barrier faces. And so the question is, so I think this may be the juxtaposition of barriers that we're installing for our removals versus barriers that private property owners would be putting on. So the question was about Brubaker and that the apron pointed away from the open space property. on Brubaker. And so I think that would have been a barrier that we installed prior to removal,
Yes.
because there are prairie dogs in the greater landscape around Brubaker. And so following the removals, the remaining prairie dogs would have been outside of the open space area that we're trying to prevent from moving in. In the case of a neighbor putting up a barrier, they would want that apron to face the open space where the prairie dogs are not being removed. Does that make sense? So I think that may have gotten a little bit confusing, because it is true. The barrier will face different ways depending on whether removal is planned on a property or not.
Yeah, that's my recollection.
So could you kind of expand on what your plans are for 2025 in terms of which properties you're going to address with removals?
So the question is, what properties are we addressing with removals? Honestly, all of them. Bully Valley Ranch is an initial site. And then between contractors and staff, we're gonna hopefully achieve 300 acres of removal. Probably can't get to 100% of them, so we like anything else, we prioritize based on what's the potential rate of spread, what's the impact to a neighbor, what's the impact to an agricultural tenant's land. But 300 acres is a lot, and we did 300 acres this year, so am I okay to say 250, Rob, to 300? Unless the sky falls, can't control the future, but that's a lot of the properties. If 2024 mapping has our follow-up control at 244 acres, so we should be around there. Ultimately into the future, we know we have to get to these properties at least twice a year, especially the ones that are abutting against other properties or large systems. But again, we'll do the best we can to kind of whittle away at the backlog of follow-up control. Hopefully I didn't overcommit, but 300 acres is a lot.
I think the landscape will be totally different if we get a good rain.
Yeah,
We get
that'd be
good
nice.
precip next spring, early summer, like we did 2 years ago. We thought we were on top of it 2 years ago,
Right,
right?
This is a bad year.
Yeah.
I think there is some combination of, so we've been actively removing since 2021,
2020.
2020, 2020.
Yeah.
So the scale of removal has grown every year. So we had several hundred acres that were clear. But as we know, they do come back. So, I mean, this year we did find that a lot of reoccupation of sites that we had cleared in prior years as well. So we expect a similar pattern next year.
And we currently have the funding, thank you, powers to be, to do the contract, to make sure we have contractors to help with this process. We're choosing sites that are in theory less expensive from barrier standpoints, but still making progress on removal from those initial sites. And we have enough funding to do 100+ acres with contractors in addition to the 220, 250 that we can do with staff. And then we'll have an additional perk machine. So we have so much support internally to get this project done. So we'll do, and I have perfect, awesome staff. So makes it a little bit easier on me, that's for sure.
How many acres do you manage overall? How much property do you have?
So the question is how much property do we manage? Is that open space in general or
In general?
what do we have?
So the city has 46,000 acres protected. Some of that is conservation easement. But we're actively managing over 36,000 with our staff.
Please speak up.
We actively manage 36,000 acres with our staff. That's how many acres open space is managing.
36,000.
36,000.
Yes.
And but you speak like you're only managing, you're really only managing a portion of that. I bicycle ride and I see areas that are obviously overpopulated with prairie dogs that the city's not doing anything with. And I know the area that I'm riding in is city property. The airport's I mean, out by the airport's a classic example. You're really only managing small portion of the 36,000 acres that you own, the city owns. And that's what's frustrating this gentleman here, is just angry. And myself and other people in the Heatherwood States area, that that it doesn't appear that anything is being done at all in the areas that you don't manage. You understand what I'm saying?
Yeah, I think there's several points of clarification. I thought you were asking how many acres as a land system are we
I was
managing
asking
for?
that to try and figure out what percentage of land you guys are actually
Right.
managing. You guys are managing probably maybe 5,000 acres of the 36,000 acres that you own.
So that was another clarification. We are managing 36,000 acres of land. Tori mentioned 5,500 or so have prairie dogs on it. The area of conflict in our agricultural areas, I believe, is in the neighborhood of 800 and some
Thanks,
acres.
so, yeah.
So right now, we're focusing on reducing the conflict on irrigated agricultural areas.
I understand that. Also, the data site that you refer to, the data portal that you refer to, does that also discuss the costs associated with your department?
We present the cost at this meeting for this project.
For the prairie dogs, I think
Agree.
Dan might be a better person to answer for department wide.
Who?
If you know, Dan Burke, our director.
Over the past few years for the prairie dog management and control, we have fluctuated between about 600,000 to about $1 million over the course of the past 5 years.
Oh, sorry. Yes. I
Yes.
could have answered that.
Yeah,
I didn't know if the open data portal had the overall open space budget
I don't think it does.
available. Okay.
Yeah, I think
That's per year?
Per year, this year, I think we're
this
gonna
year-
be around $600,000 to $700,000.
this year we spent 491,000 on this project.
Yeah, and then there's the conservation side of things. That's what I was referring to. Yeah.
Yeah, I guess that, yeah.
494 plus the conservation.
But yes, so it'll be about 690,000 total expenditures in 2024.
And I'm gonna add to that a little bit. It is a lot of money. 100,000 of that is infrastructure. Agricultural fences, gates, culverts, ditches. These are things that need to happen whether or not we remove prairie dogs or not. And so we have to keep that in mind. That's a lot. And then another 100,000 this year alone was just like seeding and stuff, that's more tied to prairie dogs. But just an important distinction that these are backlogs of agricultural infrastructure that's getting fixed because of this project.
I understand. What I was trying to get is
Yeah.
an order of magnitude idea of what the costs are associated with this whole program. Does that include the staff cost?
No,
Staff,
that does not include staff cost.
how would I find that out? What I want to do is I want to find out what the cost of the entire program is. And I don't know how large your staff is for OSMP, or the county. Just sounds like, really realistically, it's more like $1 million on average a year, or $1.5 million, just for the city, and the county has its own cost structure. That's all I'm trying to do is get an order of magnitude. I'm just trying to get an idea of what the real cost is, program. I mean,
That's fair.
not just because cost is always associated with any kind of program that's out there.
Yeah, the conversation for those online has been trying to get an overall cost for the program, including staff and contractors and theirs and stuff like
And
that.
those are numbers that we have put together some years when we've been having conversations with city, particularly with city council. about what it would take to add to the program or shift what we're doing with
Yeah.
the program and what resources would be needed for that. Back in 2018, when the Prairie Dog Working Group recommendations were approved by City Council, part of that analysis was how much additional work would need to be done. And that was actually what resulted in hiring Tori's position. So those are numbers that we've certainly had in the past. If that's something that you're very specifically interested in, I'd be happy to look at our staff numbers. It's not a super quick and easy thing to get at because it's a number of different staff spending some percentage of their time on prairie dogs. So it's not as simple as like this person and their full cost. But you'd be happy, I mean, I'd be happy to have you email me and I could send you what we could pull together on that if you're interested. I can give you my email before you leave tonight.
Okay, alls I was just wondering was what is the budgetary, I mean, what I was just trying to get to is what are the budgetary numbers?
Yeah, and I think your guesses are probably not too far off.
Pardon me?
I think that your guesses of that actual dollar expenditure plus staff is probably not too far off, although I can't say exactly what it is.
Well, thank you very much. I appreciate you.
Yep.
So, there was, one person that contacted me about Oasis. And they were concerned that, the prairie dogs had moved back in and were reinvading this property owner's hayfield and stuff. So I think they would really appreciate hearing about, your plans for Oasis. I think that would help.
The question was about Oasis and a neighbor reaching out to Elizabeth. Probably the same neighbor I've talked to. I don't know if Rob, if you've talked to her yet. Think so, yeah.
Yeah.
So we've been in communication with her and yeah, again, another one of those, hopefully we can get it done with the contractor this winter because we don't want to wait until June to start again. But the plan is to get a contract for that site sometime in January, February. And if it snows every day, then obviously we can't do it. And then it'll have to get pushed into June or July, whenever it is. But that, again, another one of those sites that's top on the list to be done in 2025.
And then the other question I have is about the shared learning collaborative. Have you been tracking, the amount of staff time and, resources that you've been putting into that? So that you have a cost for how much that particular kind of management costs to do?
So the question is about the shared learning collaborative, the amount of staff time we've contributed to that. No, the collaborative does for their time. I think you're still doing it. They have for their time. I have on purpose, intentionally reduced management to make sure we're not biasing the amount of work we're doing on that property versus other irrigated lease properties. This year we did parcel out 10 acres and we could figure out staff time to that, but we don't have a tracking mechanism currently for the restoration side of our activities. We know how much time we spend on perk and how much money we spend on barriers. But we don't have a good, effective way to track the amount of time that we're actually doing on all these restoration activities, including the shared learning collaborative. But anecdotally, it's not as much as you would imagine. We're trying to keep the amount of time we spend on that leasehold same as what we're spending on any other leasehold. So we could probably parcel something together, but it wouldn't be very accurate.
And I think most of us are willing to continue answering questions if people have them, since it is running past when we were supposed to be ending the meeting. I want to make sure that next steps were clear so that if people need to jump off the online meeting or leave, you have this information. So Tori, do you want to just run through that?
Right, so we are, yes, soliciting any comments on our 2025 plans. Email your comments to this OSMP input email on the screen, OSMP input@bouldercolorado.gov. And as I've stated, we're going to post a recording of the presentation at that website that I'm not going to recite. But you should be able to search for the annual meeting materials for 2024 and find it when it's posted in the next week or so.
And for those with comments rather than questions, submitting your comments to this email address is really the best way to get those captured. That way we have them all in one place and we can ensure that they aren't lost as we're trying to write them frantically up here or trying to pull them from the recording in the future. So if you do have a comment that you would like captured, please go ahead and even if you've mentioned it already tonight, go ahead and send it to this email address so that we're sure that it gets on our list. And those comments we review and go through before we finalize our 2025 plans. And before we present this information to our open space board in February, we will also present them with the comments that we received.
Do we have enough questions that we posted afterward? Are we going to? No, okay.
No, I think since we were able, so far we've gotten all the questions. I do have 2 comments online, but I don't see questions in them. So I'm going to encourage that person to submit those through the OSMP input email address that is on the meeting screen.
Great.
So the next thing will be the OSBT discussing this at their February meeting.
Yes, currently that's when it's scheduled. I believe it's scheduled to be a written item, but the board does have an opportunity to discuss written items, ask questions, and the public, because there's no action on this from them, it won't be scheduled for a public hearing, but the public is always welcome to comment at the public comment period at the beginning of that meeting or any other meeting on the prairie dog issues. And then following that, we will be sending an information packet to council following the board meeting, likely late February or early March, just depending on the council's calendar. Any other lingering questions? Yeah.
The meeting you're referring to, is away from open to the public?
They are, yeah, the Open Space Board of Trustees meetings are held it's typically the second Wednesday of the month down at council chambers. That information is always posted on our open space website. They're currently being held in a hybrid format, so you can either join online and comment that way and watch the meeting or show up in person to council chambers and comment. Though I would say for the next couple of months with holidays, sometimes that second Wednesday gets shifted to avoid various holidays. So double check. I don't have at my fingertips the February meeting date, which I believe is when this is scheduled, but I can probably find that. But you're not fast enough. It looks like it'll be February 12th is that February meeting. And typically those meetings start at 6 o'clock.
Cool. With everything. Well, thanks again for bearing with us with our little technical snafus at the beginning. We do appreciate your guys' interest to be here and be plugged into prairie dog management. And we're always here answering questions.
Thank you.
We done with this?
Yeah.
I'll just leave that up for now. Bye.
Detailed.